Good evening, all you twisted freaks. Welcome back. This is Insomniac Theatre, Volume 2. As we're stuck inside our hums, we find our attention drawn more and more to the screens in front of us. But what about the screens in the beyond? Tonight's twisted tale, humanity's greatest threat, itself. The stars fizzled into existence as the universe warped around my tinted cockpit. The reversion to real space jerked me back into my seat, and the usual feeling of lightheadedness struck as the last gravitational anomalies released the craft from their grip. The pervading dizziness set in, and my eyes only just managed to catch the space around me rearranging itself into the incomprehensible mess of planets, asteroids, and stars. Punctuated by the vast expanse of nothing, the tumbling balls of rock and gas held a beauty that left me breathless. I flicked up in the comm circuits, and the scanners lit up as Scythe 2 clawed back through into real space behind me, closely followed by Scythe 3. Whilst I watched for the appearances of Scythes 4 and 5, an emergency broadcast began to play. My scanner showed it originated from a signal distress beacon orbiting the single habitable world. Looking at the sensor readouts, I guess habitable is a relative term these days. Rings of debris that had once been orbital defense platforms circled the stricken planet, whilst the planet's surface boasted terrifying radiation levels and slashing, vitrified scars across its pockmarked ground. All in all, the desolated population centers of the planet Serene 4 didn't seem that habitable to me. Whilst I scanned my readouts, Scythes 4 and 5 burst into existence and pulled into formation. As one, we powered up our ion drives and started the long descent down. Hard to believe this was once a bastion of humanity's eternal empire. Not so eternal in the end, was it? How many species crushed under our boots? How many civilizations desolated to make way for our colonies? How many worlds sterilized in order to populate them with our own versions of life? Yet, even with all our might, we fell victim to nature's greatest champion. The virus tore through us like a shard of glass piercing through flesh. Patient Zero was never found, let alone where it came from. When the infection was just budding, the scientists had any number of conjectures, the result of a perfunctory sterilization or a biological weapon. The result of our new, more exotic cuisine or our tampering with genome finally gone drastically wrong. Didn't really matter. We never had the time to learn our lesson. The month-long incubation period was sufficient for it to travel across half the galactic spiral arm before we caught the stowaways in our bodies. The initial estimates placed the fatality rate at 22%. Survivable for sure, but when you're talking about hundreds of billions, the numbers start to paint a dark, dark picture. That was before our healthcare systems were swamped and we realized it was still mutating. Catching it once didn't mean you couldn't catch it again. 50% was one of the lower estimates afterwards. Even then, it wasn't our greatest threat. Humanity always reserves that for itself. The emptiness of space receded as the view from my cockpit began to fill with contorted sheets of metal and fragmented alloys. We had entered the graveyard orbiting the planet. Became a struggle to avoid the debris. Now pieces moving in kilometers per second flash by with enough momentum to knock out my craft and leave me helpless in the maelstrom. With the lack of an orbital control supplying data on the predictably moving debris, my computer was desperately trying to identify a safe path using its limited sensor info. Tiny impacts still riddled my craft as the computer prioritized avoiding the larger pieces. Thankfully, the longer it got to observe the debris, the better it could predict the paths, which meant that random jolts first slowed and then died away as my computer became comfortable in its environment. Checking my sensors, I saw none of the other ships and suffered any major damage, and were mainly through the layer of orbital debris. Our objective grew closer. The devastated surface of the planet was now visible to the naked eye. Scars of glass crisscrossed across the ground, seemingly at random. If you didn't know, you would never be able to guess how precisely those plasma beams had cut through to the settlements that use to dot these plains. Another legacy, the so brilliant strategy we sunk to. It seemed sensible at the time. Isolate planets with the virus and eliminate any forms of interstellar travel. Then someone decided destroying any ships with warp drives wasn't enough. All it took was one mistake, and we'd jeopardize the whole human race. So, we decided on genocide. Cauterize the wound. The brass had called it. If we burnt the surface to a crisp, the virus couldn't survive. No one mentioned the people lived there. Sacrifice on an unimaginable scale. But worth it. To save so many billions, right? The sensors beeped to indicate their task had been successful. They had located active signals strong enough to punch through the radiation, signs of surviving life, proof that the rumors we heard had been more than just hope. They must have had an extraordinary amount of radiation shielding to last for that long. My craft wasn't a good build, just shielded enough to deal with cosmic radiation, and it was already throwing out warnings, but I set a location marker at the signal's origin and saw the other scythes turn towards it. Once we found this settlement, I'd be able to stop worrying about the radiation anymore. The first worlds we'd burnt under the strategy were already dead. Anyone could have left had done so long ago, and the virus had caught nearly everyone left. We did our duty and moved on. The travel lockdown had slowed the spread, and it made our job more manageable, but then we started encountering current infections. Healthy people, still on the ground, and interstellar-capable ships around. They'd see us up here thinking the cavalry had arrived, that somehow we could help them, and then we'd blot them out with fire. Still, no one batted an eyelid. It had been done, and orders were orders. The infected colonies never got the info fast enough to realize our appearance was a death sentence. Always too busy focusing on their current predicament. The other colonies just wanted to survive. They turned a blind eye. What did I call it? A sensible strategy. Well, it was sensible. Sensible right up to the point that it's your homeworld the plasma bombardment is heading down to. Sensible right up until it's your finger on the trigger, sweat dripping down your back. Sensible until the people planet-side realize they've been abandoned and decide to fight back rather than accept their fate. We started seeing losses. Mutinies where crews encountered their home planets, colonies that knew what we were doing, hitting us before we could sterilize them. The mounting opposition we faced meant we no longer had the time or resources to carefully scourge every area of a planet. The new doctrine reflected that. It called for nuclear strikes against all spaceports, population centers, and orbital defense platforms before burning any known settlements off the map. We complied. The remains of the shipyards and Syrian force stretched out before us. The 5 of us set our crafts down, admiring the initiative of the survivors. Holding up in a nearly completed warship will have protected them from the worst of orbital bombardment and nuclear missiles, as well as the subsequent radiation. How'd they patched up the shielding using this decimated shipyard was beyond me, but they seemed to be managing just fine. We were finally close enough to the signal source to decipher what it said. Warning. Engine test run scheduled for 1,800 hours. Observe a 600-meter perimeter. So they had nearly got a working ship as well. I'd never believed that part of the rumors could be honest. Then again, I'd never believed the Eternal Empire could fall. In hindsight, the new doctrine is probably what broke the Empire. Surgical sterilization was justifiable, but when colonies heard the fleet was nuking its own people and burning the wreckage, they lost all trust in the Empire, and they severed ties. Communication links were cut overnight. Without info on infection, the brass decided we had to assume all severed colonies were infected. So, planet by planet, wave after wave of nuclear hell, we decimated colonies until we had whittled down to our last ships. Some were lost to defensive attempts, most lost to failed mutiny or attempted insurrection. We readied ourselves for our next target, but it never came. The 5 remaining planets under the Empire remained infection-free. Not really an empire at that point, but the strategy had worked. We were safe. Unfortunately, battleships require extensive facilities to fix and house, facilities that the remaining worlds lacked. We left our battered ships in orbit and we shuttled down to the surface. We were received as heroes, valiant protectors of the realm, as if we hadn't murdered billions and stranded billions more to be infected, all in the name of saving humanity. Of course, threats never go away. There's always something else to worry about. Right now, I'm worried about radiation. The flight suit I'm wearing will probably add a few hours to my life expectancy, something that's doubtless measured in days given the intensity of the radiation here and the weak shielding on the ship. Then again, my life isn't going to be long enough to worry about that. I open the case beside me and flick on a timer. The portable nuke starts counting down. Without warships capable of launching nukes, the brass decided on door-to-door delivery. Can't take any chances that these survivors harbor the virus, you know? This close? With 5 nukes? If the blast doesn't get them, it'll shred their shielding so the radiation will. I know what I'm doing is deplorable. It's just what gives humanity its best shot at survival. I've fallen this far. What's a little farther? What the fuck? Isn't this future story reminiscent and prescient within our current timeline? How many lives are we willing to sacrifice for capitalism? Dark web shit. I'll see you next time on Insomniac Theatre.